Oh, okie doke. Might as well get started. Hey, Larry.
Hey,
All righty then. Welcome to Weekly Marks. I think it's the 8th of March. Happy uh, International Women's Day.
hey,
I'm going to continue on, although this is actually, it's not a repeat, let's put it that way. I have to revisit Michael Heinrich again. I think we always have to revisit Michael Heinrich because he's one of the few people who actually sort of properly organize the kind of understanding that we have of the MEGA, the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe. Uh, and actually, it's very important because Heinrich gives us at least a consistent view of these matters. The real problem, of course, lies in trying to disentangle, I think, what a position the Heinrich's own position as a translator is, and how he organizes the interpretation of, you know, uh, the bulk of Marxist work. It's important for a variety of reasons. For example, Heinrich says, and I have no reason to doubt him, that historical materialism never appears in Marx's work. Um, that doesn't mean to say that it wasn't there, but certainly that's an important problem for many of us. So I've taken several things that connect and that are part of, I think, our understanding, and of course later on this year, assuming that we're all still alive, Andy Higginbottom is going to do volume 3 in the CSSGJ presentations on Marxist Capital. So the third volume is going to be something we, on the one hand, need to prepare for. On the other hand, we need to review one and volumes 1 and 2 of Capital. We're plodding through every once a week. It may turn into twice a week. The 2024 Karl Marx Capital Volume 1, the Princeton edition, with the two Pauls. Um, I think it's really important to sort of consider how the new translation is a little slightly more fluid in terms of English, and of course the difference that you'll note if you listen to Heinrich or read Heinrich is that there's always a slight difference. And I've added 2 videos to this little page. Um, one which is I think a more electronic reading of his reading of the 3 volumes, not identical to the book How to Read Marx. So there's other stuff going on, of course, somehow um, worth asking him about at some moment. And also a video by Heinrich himself from a little while back, I think 4 years ago. So those to give you a kind of background that Heinrich, I think, is has a historical place in some ways. But he's been at this for a while. So I'm going to start with a piece in Science and Society where Heinrich is talking about Engels' edition of the third volume of Capital. I'm not going to read the whole thing. There's just the front end and the back end, sort of, but to give you a flavor for why um, the subsequent volumes, 2 and 3, have, they're controversial in the sense that they're incomplete and that they represent a certain viewpoint, not only Engels, but of course of any translator about what to do with all this stuff. I've included also a link to the MEGA site itself, and for those who read German, this is important. It's also an important moment, considering that it comes in the after the fall of really existing socialism, i.e., the Soviet Union. So that these things all fit in their sort of place. And then I've included a piece from was it Crisis and Critique by Heinrich that essentially discusses not the identically same thing, but makes some reflections also on Volume 3, which I think are important because they're part of my other little project, and that is to rethink or uh, sort of regurgitate. No, it's to rethink the theories of surplus value, Marx's theories of surplus value, which are essentially a representation of a kind of middle period of Marx, if you will. Um, that is the 1861 to 63 manuscripts, which are, I think, really useful because, in the same way that it may be that Engels, unintentionally, puts us in a position where the tendency of the rate of profit to fall may have been sort of overemphasized. And I think that Heinrich doesn't necessarily emphasize that, but he sort of points that out. And I think that there was a lot of, as we know, there's a lot of ink that was spilled on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And I'm not saying that it's based on a mistake so much as it is just a line of inquiry that perhaps got overemphasized and to our chagrin, but also it's still an important idea, and one in the scheme of the many parallel issues that Marxist capital represents, and which are very, very important for the larger kind of project of transcending capitalism. Michael Heinrich and Engels' edition of the third volume of Capital and Marx's original manuscript. This is on the Marxist Internet archives. It's from an article in Science and Society from 1996 to 97. And here's the abstract. In 1993, Marx's manuscript of 1864 to 65, used by Engels as the basis for Volume 3 of Capital, became available as part of the MEGA, the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe. It is therefore now possible to compare the original manuscript with the version published by Engels. This comparison reveals that Engels made significant modifications despite his own claim to have restricted his role to one of faithfully presenting Marx's own work. Changes to Marx's text include design of headings, insertion of subheadings, and textual transpositions, omissions, and insertions. The changes have real impacts on the text, especially in the area of crisis theory, the theory of credit, and the relationship between capitalism and commodity production. Marx's thinking was far more ambivalent and much less developed than it appears to be on the basis of Engels' editing, and it is doubtful whether the materials were available to complete Capital. In any case, future studies of Marxist thought must turn, and this is important, must turn to the MEGA manuscripts rather than to Engels' Volume 3. And I'm hopeful that Andy Higeman will make a comment on that when he does his CSSGJ course on Volume 3. So I skipped to the conclusion right after the abstract. The book published by Engels in 1894 is not a mere edition of Marx's manuscript, but a far-reaching adaptation of the original manuscript. Only the smallest number of Engels' interventions is made visible. The largest extent of the alterations remains hidden to the readers, and that's kind of what the issue is for Heinrich. The interventions themselves are not just of a formal or stylistic nature, they deceive the readers about the actual extent of elaboration. They offer solutions for problems which the manuscript left open without clarification that these are Engels' solutions. And this is always the problem of reading Engels' stuff. He does an outline of capital that is sort of okay, but will actually mislead you if you're not paying attention. And in some passages, they even change the argumentation of the original text if this obstructs Engels' interpretation. Therefore, Engels' edition can no longer be considered to be volume 3 of Marx's Capital. It is not Marx's text, quote, in the full genuineness of his own presentation, unquote, as Engels wrote in the supplement, but a strong editing of this presentation, a pre-interpreted textbook edition of Marx's manuscript. So, you had to have volume 3 out there, and, so crank it out, but there are issues. The fact that Engels did not understand or undertake a textual editing fulfilling modern demands is quite understandable from the point of view of those times. Editions did not have to fulfill such high demands concerning textual loyalty as is necessary today, hence the Princeton edition. An editor was given much larger freedom than today, especially if he was spiritually close to the edited author. Furthermore, it was most important to Engels to publish a book which could serve as an intellectual weapon for the working class in the class struggle, which therefore was understandable and topical. And with all the criticisms in view, we must not forget that it was an incredible achievement to publish this manuscript, 1,000 pages, of which Marx had once said in a letter to Engels that nobody at all could publish it in a readable form except for he himself. In a letter he writes in February of 1866. Even still, all understanding for Engels' motives and procedure cannot alter the assessment that the text he has presented is by no means the third volume of Capital. Every future discussion of Marx's economic theory will have to refer to Marx's original manuscript. So, you already have this kind of textual difference. But this manuscript also cannot be simply considered to be the third volume of Capital, judging from the full elaboration of the first volume. Therefore, it is indeed a first incomplete draft, as Engels says in the preface. The gaps, however, are not of just a quantitative nature. It is not just that Marx didn't have enough time to fully accomplish an already completely sketched picture. In quite a few places, it's not even clear that what the sketches should look like on the given basis. Marx was nowhere near solving all of the conceptual problems. Even the fully developed parts of his work, such as the value and money theory of the first volume, include a number of ambivalences, which make it seem questionable whether it was in any way possible to complete Capital on the given basis. So let me stop there and say, this is how difficult the interpretation of the volumes are, but it also gives us, on the one hand, license for interpretation, um, given the kind of openness of the Marxian text, but it also forces us, in a comparative sense, to sort of get into kind of the textual resonances, let's say, of not only Marx, his contemporaries, the responses, but also the development of further ideas, as I said, about historical materialism. So the second thing here is a piece by Michael Hendricks again, from a 2016 article in Crisis and Critique called Capital After MEGA, Discontinuities, Interruptions, and New Beginnings. Note that Heinrich is spending nearly a decade on writing these things, that constantly redealing with the text. And, as apocryphal as that might be, I think it's really important to consider that he changes his mind over the years. And in response, you could say that several of Heinrich's recent texts were actually responses to other interpretive issues, he's responding to critics and blah 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 blah. But it's not simply historiographic. It is, I think, interpretive. It's meaningful. Has semantic issues, I think, that are important for those of us not only continuing the kind of work that Marx was trying to talk about, but also the politics that obtain. 50 years ago, two works were published in France which greatly influenced international discussions on Marx for many years. The first is Althusser's collection of essays, Poor Marx. And the second is the collaborative work of Althusser, Balibar, Estable, Machery, and Rancière, Lire de Capital, Lire le Capital. In particular, and it's just not reading Marx, but it's more than reading, of course. In particular, it was Althusser's theory of the noticeable break between the young philosophical and humanistic Marx in the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 and the more mature scientist of Grundrisse and Capital that prompted fierce debate. That's kind of what everyone sort of fiddles with these days. And it's important because some things just weren't published and weren't sort of open for discussion, Grundrisse, etc. Regardless of the opposition taken in this dispute concerning the relationship between his earlier and later work, the later work, dedicated to economics, which came into being from 1857, is usually considered as a single unit, but sometimes even as a double unit. On the one hand, the three big manuscripts that emerged between 1857 and 1865, that is, the Grundrisse of 57 to 58, the 1861 to 63 manuscript, which, among others, includes theories of surplus value, and the 1863 to 65 manuscript, including the main manuscript used by Engels for the third volume of Capital. That's the reason why I'm yakking about this, were the three great blueprints for the emergence of capital. On the other hand, the three volumes of Capital are considered as one unit, precisely the capital. Thus, I shall show that the adoption of a double unit cannot be sustained. So, let me break the ear for a second and say, well, is this a totalizing discourse and blah, blah, blah. It's just an attempt to find some continuity among these matters because, it is a person's life and writing, albeit intervened by Engels. After a brief overview of the development of Marx's economic critique, this discussion will first make clear that after 1857, we are dealing with two different projects. That is, between 1857 and 63, the work is laid out in 6 books: Capital, Land Property, Wage Labor, State, External Trade, and World Market, in a contribution to the critique of political economy. And this is methodologically based on the separation of capital in general, on the one hand, and competition on the other. Only since 1863 have we dealt with capital in 4 volumes in which the concept of capital in general is no longer used. Secondly, it will become clear that the 3 volumes of Capital, as they are presented in Engels' edition, are far less uniform than is usually assumed. Not only has there been significant developments in the drafts of Capital since 1863, but especially in Marx's manuscripts and letters from the 1870s, which suggest far-reaching changes that are only inadequately expressed in the edition of 3 volumes of Capital provided by Engels. So there's already a kind of transcendence of that we understand in retrospect, because that we've gone sort of, we've understood that Engels did lots of things and he made lots of changes. And on the one hand, on the other hand, we've got to go, back to the author at some moment, because, there's, certain wobbliness in the meaning. Studies such as this would have been impossible to undertake without the new Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, MEG. The new MEGA, the new MEGA, is the second attempt at a complete edition of the works of Marx and Engels. A first attempt was undertaken during the 1920s, by the famous Marx researcher and first director of the Moscow Marx-Engels Institute, David Borisovich Razhanov. In 1927, the first volumes were released in Berlin and Moscow. After 1933, German fascism and Stalinism soon thereafter made further work impossible. Stalin's henchmen shot Razhanov in 1938. A second attempt to achieve MEGA was undertaken in the 1960s by the Institutes of Marxist-Leninism in East Berlin and Moscow. The second MEGA, appearing in 1975, is not a continuation of the first, but rather an independent project. Following the fall of the Soviet Union and East Germany, the GDR, the International Marx Engels Foundation in Amsterdam has since issued MEGA. MEGA is a historically critical edition. All surviving texts, excerpts, and letters of Marx and Engels are therein contained. Due to this principle of completeness, there are a number of first editions, including Marx's original manuscripts for the second and third volumes of Capital. Furthermore, the texts in MEGA are also published faithfully. Since many texts were unfinished manuscripts, former editors, beginning with Engels, intervened to make the texts more readable, bringing them as close as possible to the presumed final state of the respective work. Interpretation of these texts had already been undertaken to some degree without this even being partially visible to subsequent readers, because many of the text changes were never documented. Now you can imagine how more complicated that is when you see it in the original German, you have the Russians fiddling around with it, etc. In contrast to this, a historically critical edition generally follows the principle of authenticity, that the author's probable intention is not redacted, but is instead presented and published in its precise existing form, that is, including all the variations and drafts. Here, the editor does not decide which draft is better, worse, or even outdated. Each MEGA volume consists of a text section and usually a separately bound appendix with text versions, descriptions of the textual evidence, explanations, indices, and an introduction about the origin of the text. MEGA is divided into 4 sections. The first section includes all works and manuscripts excluding Capital and is of 32 volumes. The second volume contains Capital, and all preparatory works is 15 volumes. The third section presents the letters between Marx and Engels, as well as the inclusion of all letters addressed to them by third parties. That's 35 volumes. And the fourth section contains 32 volumes of excerpts. To date, out of 114 volumes, just over half have been published. And this is in 2016. To date, the publication of the second section was completed in 2012. All Marx's economic manuscripts created since 1857, as well as all editions and translations of Capital, in which Marx or Engels were involved, are now available. This is why we have a 2024 English, Princeton edition. From the critical use of the political economy to its categorical criticism. Section 1. Marx was a lifelong student who was always willing to relinquish his own opinions when he recognized them to be false. It is therefore unsurprising that his extensive work shifts continually in ways that always introduce new terms, concepts, and perspectives. At the same time, there are important lines of continuity since 1843, particularly since Marx was interested in theorizing a fundamental analysis between the bourgeois state and capitalist economy from a perspective that was critical towards domination and which aimed at abolishing capitalism. Marx's own assessment concerning the development of his theory is indicated in a single text, which is located in the preface of a contribution to the critique of political economy, first issue 1859. This has been very key since the 70s. This famous preface outlines Marx's understanding of history and society. There is no discussion of historical materialism, a term not once used by Marx himself, and thus there is no reference to this concept. Additionally, this preface contains elements of Marx's intellectual autobiography. The first unpublished draft referred to by Marx in the preface to his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right of 1843 that led him to the conclusion that neither legal relations nor political forms could be comprehended whether by themselves or on the basis of a so-called development of the human mind, but rather are rooted in the social conditions of life. Hegel referred to this as civil society, but that the anatomy of this civil society, however, has to be sought in political economy. It is from this point that Marx focuses on the economy, this kind of the standard approach. In the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, Marx does not consider the economy as the subject. These manuscripts are most famous today for the development of the theory of alienation. Hence, he mentions in the German Ideology, also unpublished at the time, a title given later by the editors, that the fact that this manuscript, written by himself and Engels, was not printed was not crucial, considering that its main function was that of self-reflection, which had been fulfilled. It was important to Engels and himself to settle accounts with our former philosophical conscience. The German Ideology engages with the claims of three authors, Bruno Bauer, Max Stirner, and Ludwig Feuerbach. Although Feuerbach appears to be let off easily in this engagement, he is overall criticized at a fundamental level. By contrast, Stirner had absolutely no importance for Marx before the German Ideology. A few months earlier, with the Holy Family, Marx had already engaged with the work of his former friend Bruno Bauer. In relation to this, Feuerbach was so highly praised, as previously in the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, that Marx, after chancing upon a copy of the Holy Family in 1867, wrote to Engels saying that the Feuerbach cult he supported makes a most comical impression in hindsight. In the German Ideology and in the thesis on Feuerbach drafted shortly beforehand, Feuerbach is fundamentally criticized for the first time by Marx in order to engage his own philosophical belief with Feuerbach's philosophical approaches, an approach that centered on the notion of an essence of man. This idea, along with the resulting theory of alienation, formed the underlying basis with some important further developments for the economic and philosophical manuscripts. Although some general considerations regarding human nature are found in Capital, this highly charged notion of the alienated human being was no longer of interest. Although rarely, when Marx speaks of alienation in Capital, he no longer does so in terms of a loss of human nature, but only in relation to the inability of humans to control the social relations they produce, a finding from which the emphatic concept of the human being becomes no longer necessary. Emphasizing these differences does not mean that nothing remains of the themes and motifs of the economic and philosophical manuscripts in Marx's later work. Rather, what transpires is that all consideration of these themes and motifs take place within different theoretical coordinates. Engaging with the former conscience initiated a break with the theoretical field of classic political economy, a break which was far from complete in 1845. Now, we've referred to this before in terms of, relying in some ways on Smith and Ricardo, their arguments, and the disentanglement of that, of course, is not so much controversial, but it's just simply a matter that one has to make some decisions about. In the late 1840s, Marx considered David Ricardo as the undisputed authority in the field of political economy. In The Poverty of Philosophy of 1847, Ricardo's findings were almost emphatically celebrated and contrasted with Proudhon's turgid phrases. Marx's criticism of Ricardo at the time related only to his ahistoricism, the transformation of bounded historical categories to eternal truths. Law-like stuff. See Marx's remarks about the error of bourgeois economists in his letter to Annenkopf of 1846. However, the categories used by Ricardo and bourgeois economists of the time tended not to be criticized by Marx. For Marx, these were as valid as essentially adequate scientific expressions of capitalist relations. Now, one can therefore say that although Marx's economic writings during the late 1840s, in addition to the Poverty Philosophy and particularly Wage, Labor, and Capital, as well as the Communist Manifesto, these are all pamphlets, remember, made critical use of the bourgeois economy, these writings did not constitute a categorical criticism of the political economy of the time. Such categorical criticism was only developed in London during the 1850s. It's important to see this timeline. This brings to the second theoretical break, in addition to the engagement with his own philosophical conscience, that Marx emphasized in the 1859 preface. Following his move to London in 1850, Marx had decided to start again with his study of the economy from the very beginning again. This was due to the huge amount of publications accumulated by the British Museum and the favorable location London offered to observe civil society. This new beginning also brought about a qualitative breakthrough towards a critique of the categories themselves, and not only their ahistorical position. So, Section 2, a contribution to the critique of political economy in 6 books. 2.1, from the London Notebooks to the introduction, that is the 1850 to 57, the introduction to the critique of political economy. Ever since the mid-1840s, Marx had planned to draw up a comprehensive economic review. Once in London, he used the world's largest contemporary collection of economic literature located in the library of the British Museum and filled masses of notebooks with excerpts from different authors. Of particular importance are these so-called London Notebooks, 1850 to 1853, which contributed to the 5 volumes of MEGA, that is, Section 4, 7 to 11, 3 of which have been published so far. Although many others of Marx's economic notebooks resulted from the remaining time spent in London, his basic studies can be found in these first 24 booklets. In subsequent years, Marx repeatedly returned to these notebooks. However, until recently, these were not taken into consideration regarding discussions about Marx. Marx soon began to question Ricardo's basic theories, although he had accepted most of them previously. As illustrated in his letters to Engels, Marx initially doubted Ricardo's theory of ground rent, and soon afterwards questioned his monetary theory, as can be seen in letters in 1851. In the following years, Marx's criticisms expanded to further subject areas, eventually leading to a fundamental critique of the categories of political economy. It was already March 1851 when Marx first went beyond merely excerpting and wrote the short manuscript Reflection in 1851, which primarily broached the issues of money, credit, and crisis against the backdrop of the reproduction of capital. The likely more detailed observations on economy to which he refers in Grundrisse has not survived. That's a project in itself. More specifically, Marx targeted the work that was to be addressed in his introduction of August 1857. In the literature, this text is commonly referred to as the Introduction to Grundrisse, published in 1857 to 1858, but this assumption is highly questionable. The introduction is, as noted in the preface of 1859, an introduction to the planned, complete works of a critique of the political economy. Nevertheless, this particular manuscript, which is known today under the title Grundrisse, was not intended as a draft for the planned economic work. So this has a relative autonomy, you might say. It starts with an examination of Darimont, a Proudhon supporter. His theory of monetary reform motivated Marx to ask the fundamental question as to whether the circulation of commodities enables a necessary separate medium of exchange. Should such a connection have been demonstrated, the fundamental impossibility of those reform strategies would have been obvious because they are aimed at the abolition of money. This is Proudhon, right? A Proudhonism. While at the same time maintaining the production of private commodities. Marx's analysis of the link between the circulation of commodities and money very quickly carried on at a fundamental level that completely diverged from Darimont's reflections. Following this, he pursued similar basic considerations relating to the relation of capital. The manuscript, later titled Outlines of the Critique of Political Economy, does not even have a proper beginning because it evolved from an excerpt. It is not a quote-unquote work that could thus be introduced. Now, although Marx may have understood his 1857 introduction as the first step in a preparation for a planned complete works, its contents can be understood as a conclusion to his series of prepared excerpts and early drafts. From his previous studies, Marx extracted a conceptual and methodological summary. The considerations formulated in the introduction of 1857, such as the often mentioned ascent from the abstract to the concrete, are by no means irrefutable, but rather the first tentative attempts, which are subsequently changed in a concrete draft. Even the 1859 contribution to the critique of political economy does not even begin with a most abstract category of value, but rather with the analysis of the commodity, which, as it is put in the much later notes on Adolf Wagner, is the simplest concrete element of economic. Other considerations in his introduction, such as beginning with a section on production in general, were already abandoned during the course of his work on Grundrisse. He maintained that the sequence of categories should not be determined by their historical development, but rather by their systematic relationship within the bourgeois society as pursued in Grundrisse and in his later works. In the summer of 1857, Marx had only vague ideas regarding the structure of his planned work on economic critique. He required clarity regarding the need to start with capital as a basic relation of production. Now, although he maintained the existence of two antagonistic classes in the Communist Manifesto, the fundamental importance of the landowner's class became clear to him only during his studies in the 1850s, and therefore he considered that his work had to encompass three classes. At the end of his introduction, it is stated that the innermost structure of the civil society, on which the three great social classes are based, would be presented. Following this, the summary of bourgeois society in the form of the state would be dealt with, followed by the international value of production, and finally, the world market and crises. Now, while this six-book plan is already indicated, Marx had no detailed ideas about further subsections, which only developed during the writing process. 2.2, Grundrisse, 1857, first draft of the Critique of Political Economy, the formation period of capital in general versus competition. It is probable that Marx began writing the manuscript for Grundrisse in October of 1857, that Marx began with the preparation of his planned work and worked almost obsessively on it during the winter of 1857 to 58, had less to do with the fact that he believed that he'd come along far enough with his recent economic studies, but rather more with the fact that at the time, the economic crisis he had anticipated, this is the crisis of 1857, for years had finally begun. In the wake of this crisis, he expected a significant shock to the capitalist economy, as well as revolutionary developments similar to those of 1848. His analysis of the 1848 revolution had led him to the conclusion that the revolutionary events had very much been caused by the economic crisis of 1847 to 48, from which he comments in the 1850s, a new revolution is possible only in consequence of a new crisis. It is, however, just as certain as this crisis. Parallel to the work on Grundrisse, Marx created the Book of the Crisis of 1857, which was made up of several excerpt notebooks with material relating precisely to that contemporary crisis. This entailed that Marx sought to study the crisis processes in every detail. Both the structural considerations of his theoretical work, as well as his precise understandings of many categorical contexts, only developed during the work on Grundrisse. In this respect, we can speak of a formation period of the critique of political economy. In order to present capital, Marx initially situated himself within a trichotomy as proposed by Hegel, that is, universality, particularity, and singularity. This was presented in Grundrisse at the beginning of his chapter of Capital. It is a rather superficial structure, only tentatively dealt with by Marx. Now, the first arrangement was one Marx never returned to, as it was soon replaced with a new order. It is not only just to label the existing material, but also to establish a reasonable basis for the distinction itself. This new disposition was based on the distinction between capital in general and the competition of many capitals. This distinction expresses an insight gained during the 1850s, repeatedly emphasized in Grundrisse, that is, competition of capitals merely executes the laws of capital, but competition does not explain these laws. The bourgeois economists had surmised that competition was the natural explanation, and Marx had followed this assumption in his 1840 economic writings, as with the Wage, Labor, and Capital pamphlet. However, now that he had clarified that first and foremost the laws of capital needed to be developed without recourse to competition before their effects on competition could be studied. Thus, a general range of capital was constituted as capital, comma, so far as we consider it here, as a relationship of value and money, which must be distinguished, is capital in general, i.e., the quintessence of the characteristics which distinguish value as capital from value as simple value or money. However, this capital is not identical to an empirically existent capital, but we're concerned neither with, as yet, with a particular form of capital, nor with one individual capital as distinct from other individual capitals, etc. So he's still trying to work out the generalities. This then results in a double requirement of the presentation of capital in general, a certain content. That is, all laws of capital that appear in the competition must be shown at a certain level of abstraction, namely in the abstraction from competition of these many capitals. Capital in general is therefore not just a label that is attached to a general part of a presentation, nor is it not merely an external classification of the material to a more or less general extent. Rather, it is a certain conceptual design which only makes sense in its confrontation with the competition of many capitals. This is very dialectic of Heinrich. From Marx's April 2, 1858 letter to Engels, we know that the book on capital was expected to include four distinct sections. Section A, capital in general. Section B, competition. Section C, credit. And Section D, share capital. For the representation of capital in general, a thematic trichotomy had already been established in Grundrisse, which Marx explicitly described in his letter to Lassalle, translated as, quote, the process of production of capital, process of its circulation, the unity of the two, or capital and profit, and finally, interests, right? Marx wrote to Lassalle on February 22nd, 1858, and added that after listing the 6 books that the critique and history of the political economy and of socialism would form the subject of another work, and finally the short historical outline of the development of economic categories and relations, yet a third. So, while working on the Grundrisse manuscript, the following plan emerged, and this is, cited in many places. So, book 1 had capital, A, capital in general, and subsections, production process of capital, number 1, number 2, circulation process of capital, and number 3, capital and profit or interest. Section B is competition. Section C is credit. Section D is equity. Now, capital book 2 would be on landed property. Book 3 would be on wage labor. Book 4 would be on the state. Book 5 would be on the foreign trade book. It would be the foreign trade book. And number 6, the world market. So I've introduced it at that particular level, and then I've included another component that is from this section. I skipped ahead, and look at the section 3 of this article. Capital in 4 books, a reconceptualized project. When the first volume of Capital appeared in 1867, Marx announced a work in 4 books. That is, book 1, the production process of capital. Book 2, the circulation process of capital. Book 3, configurations of the overall process. And book 4, the history of theory. This book was expected to appear in 3 volumes. That is, book 1 in volume 1, books 2 and 3 in volume 2, and book 4 in volume 3, which is clear as mud, perhaps. Once Engels had published Book Two as Volume Two in 1885, and Book Three under a different title, and that's how it appears in the Marxist Internet Archive, The Process of Capitalist Production as a Whole, as Volume 3 in 1894, the distinction between what constituted a book and a volume had become irrelevant. Nevertheless, one should note that when Marx referred to the second volume in his correspondence in the late 1860s and 70s, always meant Book Two and Book Three. Clear as mud. In the preface, Marx described Capital as a continuation of the 1859 contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. However, not once did he mention the six-book plan that we looked at above that he had announced in the preface of the contribution, whether Capital only referred to the first volume or even just a section of the first volume of the previously planned work, or whether Capital had completely replaced this earlier plan remained unclear. And by the time we get to Heinrich Grossman of 1929, he's the first to discuss the Marx's change of plan problem. However, this only received attention since, in the late 1960s, following the publication of Roman Radulski's comments on Grundrisse, a very famous moment. Radulski emphasized both the original six-book plan and also the concept of capital in general as developed in Grundrisse. He subsequently raised the question regarding the extent to which either still have validity for capital. During the 1970s, and this is, now that I see what I've done here, this is from a different work. But anyway, where was I?
It goes up a little higher.
Okay. During the 70s, the debate took place in the German-speaking world. Focus was limited to the question of which parts of the three volumes of Capital could still be considered as belonging to the presenting of capital in general. Since the substantive definition of capital in general remains superficial, it's not asked whether a new structure had been established to replace it. Before discussing the drafts of Capital that emerged post-1963, I shall consider these structural changes in order to clarify that after mid-1863, we're effectively dealing with a project that is differently structured. Following Marx's death, Engels did precisely what Marx had tried to avoid with the Capital manuscripts. He set up print templates from the existing text by using the tools at his disposal to salvage Capital for posterity. This was the only thing Engels could do during that historical period. In 1885, Engels published Book Two as a second volume, and in 1894, he published Book Three as a third volume of Capital. Heinrich's point, of course, among many others, is that this third volume of Capital is problematic and we should probably look somewhere else for a better understanding. So, in doing so, Engels, in part, intervened heavily in Marx's manuscripts by editing, changing, cutting, introducing divisions and headings. By undertaking this editorial work, Engels faced a dilemma that he clearly expressed himself. Thus, in the preface to the third volume, he writes that he confined it simply to what was most necessary and wherever clarity permitted, while at the same time mentioning that Section 5 in particular had required significant interventions. As for the seventh section, he wrote that its endlessly entangled sentences had to be taken first, broken up before it was ready for publication. In his postscript for the third volume, Engels emphasized that he wanted to allow Marx to speak in Marx's own words. However, in a letter to Danielson in 1889, he states that, well, since this final volume is such a great and completely unassailable work, I consider it my duty to release it in a form in which the general line of argument is presented clearly and graphically. In the state of this manuscript, an initial, often interpreted, and incomplete sketch, this task is not so easy. On the other hand, Engels did not want to conceal the unfinished nature of Marx's manuscript, but rather wanted to provide as authentic a text as possible. On the other hand, especially when considering the political meaning of capital, he tried to improve its comprehensibility and present it as a largely complete work. Nevertheless, it should be ascertained that these two goals are mutually exclusive. So, thanks to the MEGA, comparison between Marx's manuscripts and Engels' edition is now available, etc., etc. Indeed, Engels made a number of changes based on his understandings of what Marx had meant. Although the text clarified a number of important points, readers were left unaware that the original text by Marx lacked clarity in these specific places. One example mentioned previously, in the 15th chapter of the third volume, Engels structured the text and chapter titles so that it closely linked the theory of crisis to the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, despite this not being the case in the original manuscript. So, just in this one example, as I've mentioned at the beginning of my little yakking here, that this may have, you know, confused people and produced a lot of ink, um, and made people pick sides and do a lot of math to try and get this to work out. Okay, so back to the critique text. The differences between Marx's manuscript and Engels' editing have previously been discussed and debated several times. In this context, over and above Engels' editing, it's also important to consider the origins of the manuscripts that he used, in that such manuscripts resulted from very different stages of Capital's preparation. The following overview should illustrate this. So, the edition of Capital by Engels, you can see, which manuscripts were used. The German edition of Volume 1, completion time of the manuscript, this is the third draft. Then there was the French translation, and this is the crux, as it were, of the Princeton translation. Now, Volume 2, and no one's done Volume 2 in kind of the post-MEGA kind of approach, I think. But the Volume 2 includes manuscripts 2 and 4 from 68 to 70 in the second draft, and manuscripts 5, 6, 7, and 8 from 76 to 81, third draft. And Volume 3, as we've noted before, is the main manuscript for Book 3 is in 1864 to 65, the first draft. Now, noting, of course, that if you thought about it, that there's probably some relation to the way in which you interpret the 84 to 85, the 64 to 65 translations, particularly in English, and that's kind of Fred Mosley has done one of these things, and that's kind of where the crux of study might have to happen. That which in Engels' edition appears not as quite finished, but a reasonably complete and concluded work is based on manuscripts that emerged at very different times. They come from different drafts of Capital and thus represent different levels of analysis. With the view that Capital was substantially complete and ready, the respective status of Marx's reflection was in fact finally fixed. The fact that Marx's empirical basis had consistently expanded, and that in Volume 3 in particular, the development of categories was far from complete, is largely ignored from this perspective. While in several respects, the second draft of Capital, that is 66 to 70, presented a clarification, elaboration, and only limited extension of the first draft from 63 to 64, the third draft, these are the later years of Marx's life, right, 71 to 81, showed a new formation period for the entire work, as confirmed by Marx's later remarks. This, despite the manuscripts, excerpts, and research interests of this third draft, by no means amount to a nearly finished work. Marx's legacy is not a finished work, but rather a research program, the vast outline of which are out now only becoming visible through MEGA. So I got to the end of this, noting that, there's this, you probably can't remember all the numbers and stuff, but this does give you a sense that there is a sense of completeness about it, but it is not a perfect completeness. And I think that Heinrich always talks about it in this way, and so that's very useful and important. The real problem, of course, is in the subsequent work by Heinrich on questions of the value form, and in English, this is that problem where we sort of reify the concept of form and we get a little thrown off. And we should think about form having a variety of ways in which you can conceive it and the ways in which it sort of represents itself in reality, however you want to describe that. But and in some ways we appreciate the phenomenological sort of approach to form. On the other hand, we need to sort of appeal to the logical questions or the logical structure that Marx brings to all of this work from his work on Hegel. So those are things I think that are kind of, particularly as um, Hegel's logic has become better explicated in the last century or so. That's kind of important. Um, so anyway, I've gotten to the end of my little yammering today. I've included two videos that can, if you don't, if you probably put you to sleep, but it's worth reading these texts because, with all due respect, Heinrich does cover retread a lot of ground, but the fundamental issues are there. That is, there is a timeline. There are complicated ways in which to approach the text. Um, he tries to establish, I think, the kind of order in which these things occur without having to get into a thing about early, late epistemological break or not, those kinds of things. That's important too, because while those are important for certain lines of inquiry, like, for example, the constant, sort of attention to alienation and estrangement, which is really important for other kinds of studies in other fields. The all of our intersectionality literature, right, it can branches back to that. With all due respect, back through Durkheim, Weber, blah blah blah. So all of these things are of a piece. You just have to go, okay, well, that's where that went, and that's where some people appealed to that, and sort of see it all in this big map of ideas and things. And so, if you look at this kind of global network, sort of lexical model, you can sort of get to a decent end on it. And in terms of my own sort of amusements, yes, there's many areas that are kind of under articulated, and it's not for want of trying to interpret Marx's scrawls, but rather to see that in the 21st century, we have to appreciate what Marx was trying to do, that he was working through a theory of capital that is not necessarily classical political economy, but that was trying to render a certain set of positions that remain still important to us from a classical point of view and not from a neoclassical point of view, because neoclassical arguments on issues of, for example, land and labor are, at least in the last century, have been kind of problematic in various ways. Some of which, were maybe rewarded in a problematic way, Nobel Prizes, but also in that it related to some fundamental issues that we've only discovered in actually trying to take Engels not simply as a bad editor, but as a thinker in his own right, which I think is the Bellamy Foster position, that you have to sort of see it as this larger scientific project, some of which, in 21st century science doesn't quite look like what it's supposed to be, but it has that same level of intention. And thanks to people like Bellamy Foster, we have a way in which we can consider um, scientific progress, however you want to describe that, as having a certain through line and continuity on the left that is um, sort of been underserved. I mean, people will give the science argument kind of lip service, but the question of what a science is also actually links back to the fundamental structural issues or structuralist issues on what counts as a human science. So all of those things actually come back together, and if you don't, um, you know, uh, don't make yourself too crazy. The gaps are there, but I think they're important gaps. They're gaps that we can fill or not fill, but they sit in this much larger project, which is useful, problematic in terms of human history, but that's kind of where we go. So I'm gonna see if there were any comments or a happy ending. Um, yes, trichotomy. Yes, the triads are very important. And also, yes, abstract to concrete, concrete to abstract. This is a continuing process, remember. This is that idea that we need to think about, that these logics are always important. Okay, so I will stop share.